At 78 years old, I thought I had reached a place in life where wisdom came naturally. I had lived through decades of triumphs and failures, each experience adding another layer to my understanding of the world. I had seen enough to know that life wasn't a fairy tale, that happiness and pain were often intertwined, and that nothing, was permanent. In my younger years, I had been driven by ambition, a need to prove myself. I wanted to be successful, to build a legacy, to make something of myself. And I did. My career was long and fruitful. I had raised children, watched them grow, and had seen the joy of becoming a grandparent. I had learned to navigate the complexities of family dynamics, the ebb and flow of friendships, and the ever-changing landscape of society. By all outward appearances, I had lived a life well lived, one filled with meaning and purpose. I had weathered the storms and enjoyed the sunshine. But at 78, I had begun to slow down. My children were busy with their own lives, and I found myself spending more time reflecting on the past. I thought I had seen it all. I had come to believe that the lessons I had learned over the years had made me invincible to the mistakes of others. After all, what could I possibly learn at this stage in life? What could go wrong? I had become complacent in my belief that my experience would guide me through anything, that I would not fall for the tricks that younger, more naive people might fall for. I was wrong. It all started innocently enough. It was the kind of thing you wouldn't think twice about, an encounter with someone new. At my age, I had learned to keep to myself, to guard my privacy, and to trust very few. But there was something about this person that drew me in. They seemed genuine, kind, and understanding. They were the type of person who listened intently, who appeared to care about what I had to say. Perhaps it was the loneliness that comes with old age, the days that stretch long with little human connection, that made me so susceptible. I had spent years taking care of others, putting their needs ahead of my own, and now that I was on the other side of life, I was seeking someone to share my experiences with, someone to listen. The mistake I made wasn't a single, glaring misstep. It was a series of small decisions, little moments of trust that built upon one another until I found myself in a situation I couldn't undo. At first, I didn't notice anything amiss. This person seemed to understand my desires, my needs, even the things I never spoke aloud. They presented themselves as someone who wanted to help, someone who could offer companionship in the later years of my life. But that's where I went wrong. I allowed myself to believe that trust was earned so easily, that at my age, I could finally let my guard down. I should have known better. The years of wisdom I had accumulated told me that people were not always what they seemed, that appearances could be deceiving. But the years of solitude, the increasing difficulty of connecting with family and friends who were busy with their own lives, made me more vulnerable than I realized. I placed my faith in someone who I thought had my best interests at heart, and that faith would come crashing down around me. In hindsight, I can pinpoint the moment when everything changed. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it set the course for everything that would follow. I had entrusted this person with something small at first, a piece of personal information, a favor, a request for help. And they had delivered, or so I thought. This was the beginning of a slow unraveling. The small favors soon turned into bigger ones. They began to ask for more from me, more time, more trust, more resources. And I gave it willingly, convinced that my judgment had not failed me. But it did. The tipping point came when I agreed to let them handle a matter I had been struggling with for a while, something personal, something I wasn't comfortable discussing with anyone else. They promised to help me, to make it right. I told myself that at 78, I deserved to have someone on my side, someone who understood. I didn't question it. I didn't second-guess my decision. I thought I had earned this moment of comfort, this connection. But I couldn't have been more wrong. The consequences of that single decision unfolded slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow creeping across the floor. There were small signs that something wasn't right, a subtle shift in tone, a word said here or there, a promise left unfulfilled. But I didn't want to believe it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my fears were unfounded. I had lived too long not to know that things rarely go as planned, and that people sometimes disappoint you. But this was different. It wasn't just a disappointment, it was betrayal. As I started to see the cracks in the foundation of my trust, I began to realize how deeply I had been deceived. My family, who had always been there for me, began to distance themselves. They didn't understand why I had placed my trust in this person. They couldn't see what I saw, or rather, what I thought I saw. My children expressed their concerns, but I dismissed them. I convinced myself that they didn't understand, that they couldn't possibly understand what it was like to be in my shoes, to be at the end of a long life, looking for someone to share it with. I had closed my ears to their warnings, and I paid the price for it. Relationships that had once been strong began to falter. My peace of mind, the very thing I had cherished, was slipping away. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had made a grave mistake, that my judgment had failed me in the most important way. But it was too late. The damage had been done. And so, here I am, at 78 years old, forced to confront the consequences of my actions. I had lived a life full of experiences, but none had prepared me for this. The truth was harsh: age didn't guarantee wisdom. In fact, sometimes it made you more susceptible to the very mistakes you thought you had long outgrown. I had trusted the wrong person, and it had cost me everything I valued. The lessons I learned came too late. But even now, as I look back on everything that happened, I can't help but wonder if it was my own fault. Could I have seen the signs sooner? Should I have listened to my family? Or was it just the inevitable result of being human, of wanting something so badly that you ignore the warnings and take the risk anyway? This is my story, a story of regret, of broken trust, and of how one mistake at the end of my life turned everything upside down. It's a story I wish I didn't have to tell, but it's one I now must share, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone else can learn from my mistakes before it's too late for them. As the days passed, the weight of the decision I had made continued to settle deeper into my chest. At first, I didn't fully comprehend the extent of the damage. The betrayal wasn't glaring, it was subtle, creeping into my life like a slow-moving storm. It started with small things, things that seemed harmless at the time. The phone calls grew more frequent, the promises more insistent. But as time wore on, the requests became less about help and more about manipulation. This person, the one I had entrusted with my life, my time, and my resources, began to reveal their true colors. I had been blind to the signs, but now, they were impossible to ignore. They were not the kind, understanding soul I had believed them to be. No, this person had a different agenda, a selfish, manipulative agenda that, for reasons I could not yet fully understand, had entangled me in their web. It wasn't just the little things anymore. It was the way they spoke to me, the way they made me feel as though I owed them something. It was the way they isolated me from my family, gently pushing them away with accusations, with small lies. I started to notice that when I spoke about my family, they would subtly undermine them, planting seeds of doubt in my mind. "They don't understand you like I do," they would say. "They only want what's best for them." At first, it seemed like a well-meaning attempt to make me feel understood, but now, I realize it was a manipulation, a way to make me rely on them, to make me doubt my loved ones. I should have seen it then, but I was too caught up in the illusion of trust. The cracks in my relationships with my family were growing wider with each passing day. My children began to notice the changes. They saw how I was becoming more withdrawn, how I was beginning to trust this stranger more than I trusted them. They tried to intervene, but I pushed them away. "You don't understand," I would tell them, my voice shaking with the desperation I didn't want to admit to myself. "I'm not like I was before. This person knows what I need." But deep down, I knew the truth. They were right to be concerned. They were right to question my judgment. I had allowed myself to be blinded by loneliness, by the desire for connection, and in doing so, I had made myself vulnerable to a person who only sought to exploit that weakness. It wasn't long before I began to feel the toll this relationship was taking on me. I had always been a strong person, capable of making decisions and standing by them. But now, I found myself second-guessing every choice I made. I no longer felt like myself. I was questioning everything, my actions, my decisions, and most painfully, my own judgment. I had been so sure that I was right. I had believed that I had found someone who could understand me in my twilight years, someone who could offer companionship, someone to share my experiences with. But the more I looked at them, the more I realized that I had been wrong. The realization hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the emotional toll that was weighing on me, it was the financial consequences as well. This person had convinced me to invest in something, a venture, a promise that seemed too good to pass up. They made it sound like the opportunity of a lifetime, something that could provide financial security in my later years. They spoke with such conviction, such certainty, that I thought it was the right thing to do. I handed over the money, without hesitation, thinking I was making a wise choice. But now, the doubt was creeping in. Where had that money gone? What had I really invested in? I tried to ask questions, to get answers, but they always had an excuse, always had a reason for why things weren't moving as quickly as they had promised. And each excuse made me feel more foolish for having trusted them. I began to feel the weight of regret settle in my chest. What had I done? How could I have been so easily deceived? I had been so sure of myself, so certain that I knew better, and yet, here I was, trapped in a situation I couldn't escape. My family's concerns were becoming more urgent. My son, in particular, tried to confront me. "Mom, please, you have to see what's happening here. This person is taking advantage of you," he said, his voice filled with frustration and concern. But I couldn't hear it. I couldn't accept that I had been wrong. Instead, I lashed out. "I don't need you to tell me what to do," I snapped. "I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions." But even as I said the words, I felt a gnawing sense of doubt creeping in. Was I truly making my own decisions? Or was I being led down a path I couldn't see? The emotional distance between me and my family was growing, and I didn't know how to stop it. I tried to talk to them, to explain my side, but every conversation felt like an argument, every word I spoke felt more desperate. I could see the hurt in their eyes, the pain of seeing someone they loved make a mistake they couldn't undo. I tried to assure them that everything would be fine, that I was in control, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. I had lost control, and it terrified me. Each day felt like a battle, a struggle to hold on to the pieces of my life that were slipping through my fingers. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of doubt, regret, and confusion. The weight of my choices was pressing down on me, and I couldn't escape it. The person I had trusted seemed to be pulling me further away from everything I had once held dear, my family, my peace of mind, my sense of self. It wasn't until I received a call one evening that I realized just how far things had gone. The call was from my daughter, her voice trembling with concern. "Mom, there's something you need to know. We found out that the person you've been spending so much time with, they've been lying to you. Everything they've told you is a scam." The world stopped for a moment. I felt my heart drop into my stomach as the truth hit me like a ton of bricks. I had been taken for a fool. I had trusted someone who had used my vulnerability against me, someone who had preyed on my loneliness, my desperation. The realization was crushing. The trust one had given so freely had been abused, and now, I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. The truth, when it finally came to light, hit harder than I could have ever imagined. The phone call from my daughter was just the beginning of the unraveling of everything I had thought was stable, secure, and within my control. My mind raced as I tried to process the gravity of her words. "A scam," she had said, and at first, it didn't fully register. I had been so blinded by my trust in this person, so wrapped up in the illusion of companionship that I hadn't seen the obvious red flags. It had all been a lie, a carefully constructed web of deceit that had ensnared me at a time in my life when I should have known better. I spent the next few hours in a haze of disbelief, unable to grasp the full extent of what had happened. How could I have been so naive? How could I have ignored all the warnings, all the signs that this person was not who they had appeared to be? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deeply I had been manipulated. Every word, every gesture had been part of the act. And I had fallen for it. The emotional turmoil I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had experienced before. I had always prided myself on being strong, on being capable, on having lived a life that had taught me to see through people, to spot dishonesty from a mile away. But here I was, at 78 years old, feeling like a fool. I couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of shame that washed over me. How had I let this happen? How had I allowed myself to be so vulnerable? The effects of the scam were felt not just emotionally, but financially. The money I had handed over, money I had worked my entire life to accumulate, was gone. I had been convinced that I was investing in something legitimate, something that would provide me with security in my later years. But instead, I had been duped. The investment was a lie, and now I was left with nothing but regret and a deep sense of loss. My family, as much as they had tried to warn me, now found themselves in the difficult position of trying to help me pick up the pieces. I could see the pain in their eyes as they realized how badly I had been taken advantage of. My son, who had always been my rock, now looked at me with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Why didn't you listen to us, Mom?" he asked, his voice trembling. "We've been telling you for months that something wasn't right." The question stung, not because I didn't understand his frustration, but because I knew he was right. I hadn't listened. I had ignored their concerns, brushed off their warnings, and now, I was paying the price. I had always been independent, always proud of the fact that I had never needed anyone to tell me what to do. But now, as the consequences of my actions began to sink in, I realized just how foolish I had been. I had let my pride, my stubbornness, blind me to the truth. My children had always been there for me, offering their support, their love, their guidance. But I had pushed them away, convinced that I knew better, convinced that I didn't need anyone's help. And now, I was reaping the consequences of my decisions. The strain on my relationships with my children was becoming unbearable. My son's anger turned into frustration, and my daughter, who had always been the peacekeeper, now struggled to find the right words to comfort me. "We're just trying to help, Mom," she said softly, her voice filled with sadness. "But you need to trust us. We want what's best for you." But how could I trust anyone now? How could I trust the very people who had deceived me so easily, who had used my own vulnerabilities against me? The emotional conflict was growing deeper, more intense with each passing day. I could no longer escape the overwhelming sense of regret that had taken root in my soul. My mind replayed the events over and over again, each time uncovering new layers of betrayal. I had been so careful throughout my life, so protective of my heart, and yet here I was, having entrusted everything to someone who had taken advantage of me. How had I been so blind? The physical toll of the stress began to manifest as well. I hadn't been sleeping well since the truth had come out. The weight of my mistake hung heavily over me, clouding my thoughts, disrupting my peace. I had always been a strong woman, capable of handling whatever life threw at me. But now, I felt broken, defeated. The simple act of getting out of bed in the morning seemed like an insurmountable task. I had lost my sense of purpose, my sense of self. What was the point of all the years I had spent building a life, only to have it all come crashing down in a moment of weakness? The guilt I felt was suffocating. I had trusted the wrong person, and now, I was paying the price. But it wasn't just the financial loss that hurt, it was the emotional toll, the realization that I had failed myself, failed my family, and failed to see the truth when it was staring me in the face. I had allowed myself to be deceived, and now, the consequences were far-reaching. But even as the weight of the situation seemed unbearable, there was a part of me that knew I couldn't give up. I couldn't allow this mistake to define me, to consume me. I had made a grave error, yes, but I still had time to make things right. At least, that's what I tried to convince myself. The road to redemption, to healing, was going to be long, but I knew I couldn't let this betrayal be the end of my story. I had to fight. I had to find a way to repair the damage I had caused, not just to myself, but to the relationships I had neglected. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but I was determined to regain control of my life, to rebuild what had been shattered, even if it meant facing my deepest regrets head-on. The days after my daughter's phone call were filled with a heavy, oppressive silence. The once vibrant life I had lived seemed to have faded into the background as I found myself consumed by the overwhelming sense of loss, betrayal, and regret. I could barely bring myself to face my children, knowing the hurt I had caused them. Every conversation felt like an interrogation, every look from them a silent accusation. My son's frustration was palpable, his anger simmering beneath the surface. My daughter, usually the calm one, was now distant, her concern mingled with a quiet sorrow that cut deeper than I expected. They were all trying to help, trying to fix what I had broken, but I felt powerless to accept their support. The emotional distance between us was growing, and it was becoming harder to bridge the gap I had created. I had always been the strong one in the family. I had prided myself on being the pillar of support for my children, the one they could rely on when life threw its challenges at them. But now, I found myself the one in need of support, and it felt like I had no one to turn to. I had alienated my family, pushed them away when they had tried to warn me. Now, I was left with nothing but the crushing weight of my mistake and the realization that I had lost their trust. The financial fallout was the least of my worries. It was the emotional toll that gnawed at me, the deep regret that consumed my every waking moment. I couldn't escape the truth. I had trusted the wrong person, and that trust had cost me everything. My peace of mind, my relationships, my sense of security, everything had been shattered in the blink of an eye. I had been so certain, so confident in my judgment, and yet, here I was, questioning everything I had ever known. But it wasn't just the regret that was eating away at me. It was the nagging feeling that there was something more to this betrayal than I had initially realized. I couldn't shake the sense that I had been part of something bigger, something darker than I could comprehend. The person I had trusted had seemed so genuine, so kind, but now, I wondered if that had all been a carefully constructed facade. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things that didn't add up. I had to know the truth. I had to understand what had really happened, what I had truly gotten myself involved in. One evening, after another long day of futile attempts to make amends with my family, I found myself alone in my living room, staring at the walls that once felt like a sanctuary. The house felt empty, too quiet, too still. I had always been comfortable in my solitude, but now, it felt suffocating. The weight of my mistakes pressed down on me, and for the first time in years, I felt utterly helpless. I could no longer ignore the feeling that I had been manipulated on a scale I hadn't yet realized. It was in that moment of desperation that I decided to take action. I couldn't just sit idly by, waiting for the consequences of my actions to fully unfold. I had to do something. I had to confront the person who had turned my life upside down and find out what they had really been after. I had been so careful for so long, but now, I realized that it was time to stop hiding from the truth. It was time to face the reality of the situation head-on. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, research, and preparation. I knew that confronting this person would not be easy, but I had no other choice. My family's concerns were legitimate. They had been right all along, and now, I had to admit to myself that they had been trying to protect me from the very thing I had allowed myself to fall into. But I couldn't undo the past. What was done was done. I could only move forward, step by step, with the hope that I could repair some of the damage I had caused. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. I had been gathering information, piecing together the puzzle that had eluded me for so long. The more I learned, the more I realized just how deeply I had been taken in. The person I had trusted had not only lied to me, but they had been using me as a pawn in a much larger game, one I had been completely unaware of. The realization hit me hard, like a wave crashing over me. I had been played, manipulated, and used for someone else's gain. When I finally confronted them, the exchange was tense, charged with the anger and frustration that had been building inside me for weeks. The person's calm demeanor only infuriated me more. They tried to downplay everything, to make me believe that I had misunderstood, that I had been mistaken. But I knew the truth now. The lies were unraveling before my eyes, and as each layer was peeled away, I felt more and more disgusted by what had transpired. This person, who had seemed so trustworthy, had been playing me all along. They had known exactly how to manipulate me, how to gain my trust, and how to keep me hooked long enough to get what they wanted. I could feel the anger rising inside me, a deep, visceral reaction to the betrayal. But I couldn't let it consume me. As much as I wanted to scream, to lash out, I knew that would only make things worse. I had already made the mistake of letting my emotions cloud my judgment. This time, I had to stay calm, stay focused. I had to get the answers I needed, no matter how difficult it was. The confrontation was a turning point for me. It was the moment when I finally stopped being a passive participant in my own life and took control of the situation. I could no longer let this person dictate my actions, my decisions, or my emotions. I had to take charge, even if it meant facing the harsh truths I had been avoiding for so long. But even as I confronted them, I knew that the journey wasn't over. The emotional scars were deep, and the road to healing would be long. The confrontation had been necessary, but it was only the beginning. I had to rebuild my life, my relationships, and my peace of mind, one step at a time. The emotional toll would not vanish overnight, and I knew that the consequences of my actions would continue to ripple through my life for years to come. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had confronted the problem head-on, and in doing so, I had taken the first step toward healing. The confrontation had not gone as I had hoped. Despite my attempts to remain calm, to assert myself, the person I had trusted with everything still managed to weave a web of lies, manipulating the situation to their advantage. Even as I walked away from that conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been left with more questions than answers. The lies had been exposed, but the truth still felt elusive. What was their true goal? What had they really been after all this time? In the days that followed, I found myself ruminating over the confrontation, replaying every word, every look, every exchange. The guilt weighed heavily on me, suffocating me with each passing hour. I had trusted someone who had deceived me so thoroughly. I had ignored the warnings, dismissed the concerns of my family, and had allowed myself to be taken in by their charm, their false promises. Now, I was left with the consequences. The trust that had been shattered in an instant was not something that could be easily rebuilt. I tried to focus on my relationships with my children, but the emotional distance that had grown between us seemed insurmountable. My son was still angry, still frustrated with me, and my daughter's sadness had turned into a quiet, painful resignation. They had tried to protect me, and I had pushed them away. Now, I could see the hurt in their eyes every time we spoke. They no longer trusted me, and I didn't know how to regain that trust. The isolation I had felt before seemed to grow even more pronounced. I found myself withdrawing into myself, unable to connect with anyone. The emotional strain was beginning to take its toll on my health. I wasn't sleeping well, and the stress was eating away at me. My once peaceful existence was now a constant battle against my own thoughts, my own feelings of guilt and shame. I had made the mistake of trusting the wrong person, and now I had to live with the consequences of that decision. But as the days dragged on, I realized that I couldn't keep blaming myself. Yes, I had made a mistake, but I had to stop punishing myself for it. I couldn't change the past, but I could control how I moved forward. The weight of my regrets was heavy, but I couldn't let it consume me entirely. I needed to find a way to repair what had been broken, to restore some semblance of peace to my life. The realization came slowly, but it hit me like a wave. I had been focusing too much on the external consequences of my actions, on the financial loss, on the broken relationships, on the shame. I had been so consumed by the fallout that I hadn't taken the time to look inward, to see how I could heal myself. The emotional damage that I had inflicted on myself was just as significant, if not more so, than the damage done by the person I had trusted. I had allowed my emotions to cloud my judgment, to distort my sense of self-worth. I had let this mistake define me, and that needed to stop. I began to make small changes in my daily routine. I started taking walks in the mornings, trying to clear my mind. I read more, not to escape, but to help myself grow. I reached out to my family, but this time, I did it with humility, acknowledging the pain I had caused them and asking for their forgiveness. It wasn't easy. My son was still hesitant to engage with me, and my daughter was still distant, but I could see the faintest glimmer of hope in their eyes. They weren't ready to forgive me, but they were willing to listen, to try to understand. As I started to rebuild the broken bridges with my family, I realized that healing wouldn't happen overnight. It wasn't just about apologizing or making amends, it was about showing them through my actions that I was committed to change, that I was ready to learn from my mistakes. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. I had to prove to them that I was capable of making better choices, that I could be the person they once trusted. It was going to take time, but I was willing to put in the effort. Meanwhile, the emotional fallout from my mistake continued to weigh heavily on me. I couldn't shake the feelings of regret and guilt that still lingered. I had been so sure of my decisions, so certain that I had made the right choices, but now, I knew the truth, I had been deceived. And what hurt the most was that I had allowed it to happen. I had allowed myself to be manipulated, to be blinded by my own desires, my own need for connection. I had let my vulnerability become my greatest weakness. The deeper I delved into the aftermath of my actions, the more I began to realize just how much I had allowed this person to affect me. It wasn't just about the financial loss, the betrayal, or the broken relationships, it was about the emotional toll it had taken on my sense of self. I had lost my confidence, my trust in my own judgment. I had lost my peace of mind. And that, more than anything else, was what I needed to reclaim. I began to take steps, small as they were, to regain control of my life. I sought therapy, not because I thought I was broken, but because I knew that I needed to address the emotional scars that this experience had left on me. I began to explore the reasons why I had allowed myself to fall into this trap, why I had trusted someone I should have never trusted. The answers weren't easy to find, but as I dug deeper, I began to understand myself better. I wasn't just a victim of circumstance. I had made choices that had led me down this path. And that was a hard pill to swallow. But even as I began to heal, even as I worked through the emotional fallout of my mistakes, I knew that I couldn't change the past. The damage had been done. What I could change was how I moved forward, how I rebuilt my life, how I learned to trust myself again. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity. The path to healing wasn't easy, but it was a path I had to walk. I couldn't stay stuck in the past. I had to keep moving forward, one step at a time, and hope that with each step, I was getting closer to the person I wanted to be. The days following my small attempts at rebuilding felt like a battle fought with no clear end in sight. The emotional toll that had once seemed bearable now felt suffocating, as if the weight of my mistakes was crushing me from all sides. Every morning, I woke up with the same gnawing sense of regret, the same quiet anxiety that followed me like a shadow. I had tried to put one foot in front of the other, tried to make amends with my family, but something was missing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still trapped in the wreckage of my own decisions, unable to break free. The emotional distance between me and my family remained wide, despite my best efforts. Every time I reached out to my son, every time I tried to reconnect with my daughter, it felt like I was being met with an invisible wall. The words they spoke were polite, but they lacked the warmth and trust that had once defined our relationship. It was as though they were still waiting for something, waiting for me to prove that I had truly learned from my mistakes, that I had truly changed. And as much as I wanted to rebuild what had been broken, the truth was that I didn't know how. I didn't know how to regain their trust, how to make them see that I was still the same person beneath the mistake. There was a deep, gnawing loneliness that I hadn't anticipated. I had spent so many years surrounded by my family, my friends, and the comfort of routine that I hadn't realized how much I had taken it all for granted. Now, I felt as though I was on the outside looking in, unable to bridge the gap between the person I had been and the person I had become. My children, my once closest companions, now seemed like strangers, their eyes filled with disappointment, their words heavy with unspoken feelings. The emotional fallout was not confined to my family alone. The pain of my decision had seeped into every corner of my life. I had always believed that age and experience would protect me from making foolish choices, but now I knew that was a lie. No amount of wisdom, no amount of time could shield me from my own vulnerabilities. I had made a choice that had irrevocably changed the course of my life, and now I was forced to live with the consequences. In the quiet moments, when I found myself alone with my thoughts, I couldn't help but replay every detail of the past few months. The lies that had been spun around me, the manipulation that had been so expertly executed, the trust one had given so freely, all of it felt like a cruel joke. How had I not seen it? How had I allowed myself to be taken in by someone who had nothing but deceit to offer? The answers were elusive, slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. I couldn't make sense of it, no matter how hard I tried. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the realization that I had allowed myself to be so easily deceived. I had been so sure of my judgment, so certain that I knew what was best for me. But now, I had learned the hard way that wisdom didn't come with age alone. It came with self-awareness, with the ability to listen to the people who cared about you, to the warnings that you might not want to hear. But I had ignored all of that. I had let my emotions cloud my judgment, and now I was paying the price. As the emotional fallout continued to weigh on me, I found myself sinking into a deeper sense of despair. It wasn't just the sense of loss that consumed me, it was the loss of who I had been. The strong, independent woman I had always prided myself on being seemed like a distant memory. I had let my guard down, allowed myself to trust the wrong person, and now I was left with nothing but the remnants of my own poor choices. The emotional cost was becoming unbearable, and I felt as though I was drowning in it. I couldn't escape the feeling of shame that followed me everywhere I went. Every conversation felt like a reminder of how I had failed. The anger that had once been directed at the person who had deceived me had now turned inward, toward myself. I had trusted the wrong person, and I had paid the price for it. But more than that, I had allowed myself to believe that I was beyond making such mistakes. I had convinced myself that I knew better, that my years of experience had taught me everything I needed to know. But in the end, it was those very years of experience that had made me complacent, that had allowed me to let my guard down in the first place. The realization that I had failed to protect myself, that I had allowed someone else to take advantage of my vulnerabilities, was a hard pill to swallow. I had spent my life building walls around my heart, protecting myself from the hurt that came with trusting others. But in this case, I had let those walls crumble, and in doing so, I had exposed myself to the very thing I had spent my life avoiding: betrayal. I had thought that the worst of it was over, that once I confronted the person who had deceived me, once I acknowledged my mistakes, I would be able to move forward. But now, I realized that the real work was just beginning. It wasn't enough to simply admit that I had made a mistake, I had to rebuild the parts of myself that had been shattered by that mistake. I had to learn how to trust again, how to forgive myself for the damage I had caused, and how to reclaim my peace of mind. But the truth was, I wasn't sure how to do any of that. I wasn't sure how to rebuild the relationships that had been broken, or how to restore the confidence that I had lost. I wasn't sure how to stop the guilt and shame from consuming me, how to stop feeling like a failure at the one thing I had always prided myself on: my ability to make sound decisions. It was in this moment of crisis that I realized something important: healing wasn't going to be a linear process. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. The pain I felt, the emotional fallout from my mistakes, was something I had to face head-on, something I had to work through at my own pace. I couldn't rush it, and I couldn't avoid it. But one thing was clear: I had to start somewhere. I reached out to my therapist again, this time with a new resolve. I couldn't continue down this path of self-doubt and guilt. I had to find a way to forgive myself, to rebuild my sense of self-worth. It was a long, difficult journey, but I knew it was the only way forward. The crisis I was facing was a turning point, not just in my relationships, but in how I viewed myself. I had made a mistake, yes, but that mistake didn't define me. It was just one chapter in the story of my life, and it was up to me to decide how the next chapter would unfold. The days and nights began to blur into one another, and with each passing moment, I found myself inching forward, though it often felt like I was moving through molasses. Healing, I realized, wasn't a one-time act, nor was it as simple as picking up the pieces and continuing on as if nothing had happened. It was slow, agonizing, and filled with moments of doubt. But there was something different about how I approached it now. For the first time, I wasn't just trying to fix the world around me, I was trying to fix myself. I had spent my life building walls to protect my heart, but now I needed to dismantle those walls, brick by brick. It wasn't easy. The guilt that had been eating away at me for so long still lingered like a heavy weight in my chest. Every time I looked at my children, I saw the disappointment in their eyes, the hurt that I had caused. My son's distant gaze and my daughter's quiet sorrow still haunted me. But this time, I refused to let those feelings control me. I couldn't keep punishing myself for what I couldn't undo. The only thing I had the power to change now was the future. I started small, simple things that seemed insignificant, but each one was a step toward healing. I took time every morning to reflect, to meditate, and to remind myself that I wasn't defined by the mistake I had made. I tried to forgive myself for what had happened, though it was far from easy. It was as though every time I took a step forward, a part of me wanted to pull back into the shadows of my guilt. But with each effort, each moment of self-reflection, I felt a tiny crack form in the walls I had built around my heart. It was slow, but it was progress. I sought therapy more consistently, and it was in those sessions that I began to understand the root of my mistake. It wasn't just a matter of trusting the wrong person. It wasn't about one bad decision. It was about the deep-seated need for connection, for someone to see me, to hear me, especially in my later years. It was that longing that had made me vulnerable, that had made me disregard the warnings, the red flags. I hadn't realized it before, but now I could see how much my desire for companionship had clouded my judgment. In the past, I had prided myself on being independent, on standing on my own 2 feet. But as I grew older, I found myself longing for someone who could share in my stories, someone who could walk alongside me in the quiet days. And in that loneliness, I had made myself susceptible to manipulation. Therapy allowed me to confront these deep emotional needs, to examine why I had let myself fall into such a position. It wasn't easy to admit that, after a lifetime of being strong, of being the one others could rely on, I had become desperate for validation, for connection. But the more I understood about myself, the easier it became to forgive. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to allow the healing process to begin. The hardest part, though, was still trying to repair my relationships with my family. They were the people who had been there for me, the people I had hurt the most. I knew that words alone wouldn't fix what had been broken. I had to show them, through my actions, that I was committed to making things right. I started by acknowledging the pain I had caused, not just apologizing, but deeply reflecting on how my choices had affected them. I made it clear that I wasn't expecting them to forgive me right away. I wasn't looking for instant absolution. I simply wanted them to see that I was trying, that I was aware of the damage I had caused and was doing everything in my power to rebuild what I had broken. One evening, as I sat across from my son at the dinner table, I tried to break the silence that had settled between us. It wasn't easy. The words caught in my throat, and for a moment, I wondered if I would ever be able to make things right. But then I remembered something my therapist had said: healing takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. I know I've hurt you, I said, my voice quiet but steady. I know I've made mistakes, and I don't expect you to forgive me just like that. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm working on myself, and I hope one day, you can see that. There was a long pause before he spoke. His eyes were tired, his frustration still evident, but there was something in his expression that made me feel like a small crack had formed in the wall between us. I don't know if I can forgive you right away, Mom, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I can see that you're trying. And that means something. It was the first time in a long while that I had felt a flicker of hope, a sense of possibility that maybe, just maybe, things could start to heal. I turned to my daughter, who had been sitting quietly across the room, her gaze distant. I knew she had been struggling with her own pain, but I also knew she hadn't been able to express it as openly as my son. Her silence had been the most painful part of all. But now, as I looked at her, I saw something softening in her eyes. She didn't say much, but she nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," I said softly, the words that had been so hard to say finally flowing freely. "I love you both more than anything, and I don't want to hurt you anymore. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm going to keep working to make it right." It wasn't just the sense of loss that consumed me, it was the loss of who I had been. The strong, independent woman I had always prided myself on being seemed like a distant memory. I had let my guard down, allowed myself to trust the wrong person, and now I was left with nothing but the remnants of my own poor choices. The emotional cost was becoming unbearable, and I felt as though I was drowning in it. I couldn't escape the feeling of shame that followed me everywhere I went. Every conversation felt like a reminder of how I had failed. The anger that had once been directed at the person who had deceived me had now turned inward, toward myself. I had trusted the wrong person, and I had paid the price for it. But more than that, I had allowed myself to believe that I was beyond making such mistakes. I had convinced myself that I knew better, that my years of experience had taught me everything I needed to know. But in the end, it was those very years of experience that had made me complacent, that had allowed me to let my guard down in the first place. The realization that I had failed to protect myself, that I had allowed someone else to take advantage of my vulnerabilities, was a hard pill to swallow. I had spent my life building walls around my heart, protecting myself from the hurt that came with trusting others. But in this case, I had let those walls crumble, and in doing so, I had exposed myself to the very thing I had spent my life avoiding: betrayal. I had thought that the worst of it was over, that once I confronted the person who had deceived me, once I acknowledged my mistakes, I would be able to move forward. But now, I realized that the real work was just beginning. It wasn't enough to simply admit that I had made a mistake, I had to rebuild the parts of myself that had been shattered by that mistake. I had to learn how to trust again, how to forgive myself for the damage I had caused, and how to reclaim my peace of mind. But the truth was, I wasn't sure how to do any of that. I wasn't sure how to rebuild the relationships that had been broken, or how to restore the confidence that I had lost. I wasn't sure how to stop the guilt and shame from consuming me, how to stop feeling like a failure at the one thing I had always prided myself on: my ability to make sound decisions. It was in this moment of crisis that I realized something important: healing wasn't going to be a linear process. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. The pain I felt, the emotional fallout from my mistakes, was something I had to face head-on, something I had to work through at my own pace. I couldn't rush it, and I couldn't avoid it. But one thing was clear: I had to start somewhere. I reached out to my therapist again, this time with a new resolve. I couldn't continue down this path of self-doubt and guilt. I had to find a way to forgive myself, to rebuild my sense of self-worth. It was a long, difficult journey, but I knew it was the only way forward. The crisis I was facing was a turning point, not just in my relationships, but in how I viewed myself. I had made a mistake, yes, but that mistake didn't define me. It was just one chapter in the story of my life, and it was up to me to decide how the next chapter would unfold. The days and nights began to blur into one another, and with each passing moment, I found myself inching forward, though it often felt like I was moving through molasses. Healing, I realized, wasn't a one-time act, nor was it as simple as picking up the pieces and continuing on as if nothing had happened. It was slow, agonizing, and filled with moments of doubt. But there was something different about how I approached it now. For the first time, I wasn't just trying to fix the world around me, I was trying to fix myself. I had spent my life building walls to protect my heart, but now I needed to dismantle those walls, brick by brick. It wasn't easy. The guilt that had been eating away at me for so long still lingered like a heavy weight in my chest. Every time I looked at my children, I saw the disappointment in their eyes, the hurt that I had caused. My son's distant gaze and my daughter's quiet sorrow still haunted me. But this time, I refused to let those feelings control me. I couldn't keep punishing myself for what I couldn't undo. The only thing I had the power to change now was the future. I started small, simple things that seemed insignificant, but each one was a step toward healing. I took time every morning to reflect, to meditate, and to remind myself that I wasn't defined by the mistake I had made. I tried to forgive myself for what had happened, though it was far from easy. It was as though every time I took a step forward, a part of me wanted to pull back into the shadows of my guilt. But with each effort, each moment of self-reflection, I felt a tiny crack form in the walls I had built around my heart. It was slow, but it was progress. I sought therapy more consistently, and it was in those sessions that I began to understand the root of my mistake. It wasn't just a matter of trusting the wrong person. It wasn't about one bad decision. It was about the deep-seated need for connection, for someone to see me, to hear me, especially in my later years. It was that longing that had made me vulnerable, that had made me disregard the warnings, the red flags. I hadn't realized it before, but now I could see how much my desire for companionship had clouded my judgment. In the past, I had prided myself on being independent, on standing on my own 2 feet. But as I grew older, I found myself longing for someone who could share in my stories, someone who could walk alongside me in the quiet days. And in that loneliness, I had made myself susceptible to manipulation. Therapy allowed me to confront these deep emotional needs, to examine why I had let myself fall into such a position. It wasn't easy to admit that, after a lifetime of being strong, of being the one others could rely on, I had become desperate for validation, for connection. But the more I understood about myself, the easier it became to forgive. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to allow the healing process to begin. The hardest part, though, was still trying to repair my relationships with my family. They were the people who had been there for me, the people I had hurt the most. I knew that words alone wouldn't fix what had been broken. I had to show them, through my actions, that I was committed to making things right. I started by acknowledging the pain I had caused, not just apologizing, but deeply reflecting on how my choices had affected them. I made it clear that I wasn't expecting them to forgive me right away. I wasn't looking for instant absolution. I simply wanted them to see that I was trying, that I was aware of the damage I had caused and was doing everything in my power to rebuild what I had broken. One evening, as I sat across from my son at the dinner table, I tried to break the silence that had settled between us. It wasn't easy. The words caught in my throat, and for a moment, I wondered if I would ever be able to make things right. But then I remembered something my therapist had said: healing takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. I know I've hurt you, I said, my voice quiet but steady. I know I've made mistakes, and I don't expect you to forgive me just like that. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm working on myself, and I hope one day, you can see that. There was a long pause before he spoke. His eyes were tired, his frustration still evident, but there was something in his expression that made me feel like a small crack had formed in the wall between us. I don't know if I can forgive you right away, Mom, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I can see that you're trying. And that means something. It was the first time in a long while that I had felt a flicker of hope, a sense of possibility that maybe, just maybe, things could start to heal. I turned to my daughter, who had been sitting quietly across the room, her gaze distant. I knew she had been struggling with her own pain, but I also knew she hadn't been able to express it as openly as my son. Her silence had been the most painful part of all. But now, as I looked at her, I saw something softening in her eyes. She didn't say much, but she nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. I'm sorry, I said softly, the words that had been so hard to say finally flowing freely. I love you both more than anything, and I don't want to hurt you anymore. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm going to keep working to make it right. It wasn't a grand gesture, and it didn't erase the pain. But for the first time in months, I felt like a glimmer of understanding had passed between us. The healing had begun, not in a rush, not in a sudden epiphany, but in small, deliberate steps. I was learning to forgive myself, and in doing so, I was allowing my family the space to do the same. As I continued my journey of self-discovery and emotional healing, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. The pain of the betrayal, the consequences of my decisions, would always be a part of my story. But I was no longer defined by my mistakes. I was learning to reclaim my sense of self, to rebuild the trust one had lost, not just in others, but in myself. Healing is a process, one that requires patience, self-compassion, and the willingness to face the darkest parts of ourselves. It isn't linear, and there are days when it feels like the weight of the past is too much to bear. But with each step I take, I move closer to peace. And in time, I hope to be able to look back on this chapter not with regret, but with the understanding that it was an essential part of my journey toward becoming the person I am meant to be. The healing process, despite its ups and downs, had reached a critical juncture. I had made progress, certainly, but there was something in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake, the unanswered questions, the lingering doubts. The person who had caused me so much pain, who had shattered my life and manipulated me, still hadn't truly faced any consequences for their actions. I had confronted them before, but that had been nothing more than a verbal exchange. I knew there was more to uncover, more to understand about their motives, about what they had truly been after. The unfinished business hung heavily over me like a dark cloud, and I knew that I couldn't move forward until I confronted it one last time. My family had seen the shift in me. They could tell that I was trying, that I was no longer the woman who had been consumed by guilt and regret. But as I continued to heal, I realized that this final confrontation was not just about me finding closure, it was about facing the truth, about holding the person accountable for the damage they had caused. I could no longer sit idly by, wondering if I would ever get the full story. I needed answers, and I needed them now. It took everything in me to summon the courage to pick up the phone and make that call. I had learned the hard way that not all confrontations would go the way I hoped, that not all people would be forthcoming with the truth. But this time, I wasn't going to let them control the narrative. This time, I was going to be the one who took charge. I dialed the number, and for a long moment, I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. The line clicked, and then their voice came through, smooth and practiced, as though nothing had happened. It was the same calm, soothing tone that had once made me trust them. But now, every word they spoke felt like a manipulation, a carefully crafted lie meant to deflect the truth. "Hello," they said, as though they had no idea who was calling. But I knew better. They knew exactly who it was. "I need answers," I said, my voice steady despite the turbulence I felt inside. "It's time for the truth. No more lies, no more excuses." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought they might hang up, but then they responded, their voice oozing with false concern. "What do you mean? I don't know what you're talking about." The calmness in their tone was infuriating. How could they still play this game? How could they be so heartless, so indifferent to the pain they had caused? But I wasn't going to be swayed this time. I had spent far too long giving them the benefit of the doubt, forgiving them for things that I should never have allowed in the first place. "No more games," I replied, my voice firm. "You've taken enough from me. It's time for you to face the consequences of what you've done." They sighed, almost theatrically, and I could hear the familiar shift in their voice, the subtle hint of defensiveness that was always present when they knew they were cornered. "What do you want from me?" "I've already explained everything." "No, you haven't," I said, my voice rising with the frustration I had been holding in for so long. "You've lied to me, manipulated me, and taken advantage of my trust. You've hurt me in ways I can't even begin to explain. And now you're going to answer for it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought they might say something to justify their actions, some excuse to make it all seem less terrible than it was. But instead, they were quiet. And in that silence, I found something unexpected, a sense of power, a sense of control. For the first time since all of this began, I felt like I was the one who held the reins. "I don't expect you to understand the damage you've done," I continued, my voice steady and cold. "But you'll never manipulate me again. I'm not afraid of you anymore." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then the silence deepened. I wasn't sure if they were processing what I had said or if they were simply figuring out how to respond. But I didn't care. I had spoken my truth, and that was all that mattered. Finally, they spoke, but their tone had changed. It was no longer the smooth, practiced calm I had come to expect. Now, there was a hint of frustration in their voice. "You're making a mistake," they said. "You have no idea what you're doing. You're only making things harder for yourself." But I had heard enough. I had spent years listening to their manipulations, to their lies, and I was done. "No," I said, my voice hardening. "I'm not making a mistake. You are. You've taken enough from me, and I'm done. Whatever this is, it ends now." There was another long pause. I could almost hear them scrambling for a way out, for a way to deflect the blame back onto me. But I wasn't giving them that chance anymore. I wasn't the same person I had been when they first entered my life. I had grown stronger, more aware, and more in control of my own emotions. "This is over," I said one last time, and with that, I hung up the phone. The silence in the room after the call was deafening. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. I had confronted them, faced them head-on, and for the first time, I felt a sense of clarity. The final confrontation had been necessary, not just for the closure I had been seeking, but for my own peace of mind. I had taken back my power. I had stopped letting them control my emotions, my decisions, and my life. But even as I sat there, breathing in the aftermath of that conversation, I knew that there was still work to be done. The healing was far from over. There were still scars to be mended, relationships to repair, and trust to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had taken a step toward true emotional freedom. The battle wasn't won, not yet, but I had finally taken control of my own story. And that, I knew, was the beginning of my real healing. The days that followed the final confrontation were some of the most reflective and painful of my life. I had taken the necessary steps to confront the person who had deceived me, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my sense of power, but there was a sense of finality that wasn't quite as comforting as I had expected. It wasn't the end of the pain, the betrayal, or the long journey of healing that lay ahead. It was, however, a pivotal moment. A turning point where I could either sink further into the consequences of my mistakes or rise, using the lessons I had learned as a foundation for rebuilding my life. For the first time, I allowed myself the space to truly feel the weight of everything that had happened. I had spent months, perhaps even years, running from my own emotions, distracting myself with work, with the illusion of control. But now, there was no escaping it. I had to face the fact that my trust had been broken, my judgment clouded, and the people I loved most had been hurt because of my choices. But instead of sinking into despair, I chose to acknowledge those emotions, to feel them fully, without pushing them away. The guilt that had haunted me for so long was still there, a constant companion that I couldn't quite shake. But as I sat in the quiet of my home, I started to realize something important. Guilt, though painful, was a natural response to the damage I had caused. It was part of the healing process. It was how I could recognize the harm I had done and understand the gravity of my actions. But it didn't have to define me. The guilt didn't have to consume me, it was just one part of the larger journey. I spent more time with my family in the days that followed, trying to rebuild the trust that had been damaged. The process was slow, painstakingly so. I understood now that trust wasn't something that could be repaired overnight. It wasn't enough to simply apologize and expect things to go back to normal. My family needed to see that I was truly committed to making things right, that I wasn't just offering words, but that I was showing them, through my actions, that I had changed. My son, who had been the most vocal in his frustration with me, was still wary. I could see the hesitation in his eyes whenever we spoke, the wall that remained between us. But there was a flicker of hope in his responses. He no longer shouted at me or avoided me. He listened, and sometimes he would share small pieces of himself, his thoughts, his concerns. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel hope. Hope that we could rebuild, even if it took time. My daughter, too, was a work in progress. She had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth things over. But she had been hurt, too, and I knew that her healing process would take longer. There were moments when we would sit together, in silence, simply sharing space. She didn't need me to fix everything. She just needed to know that I was there, that I was trying, and that I understood the pain I had caused. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't linear. There were moments when I felt like I was taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The weight of my actions was still heavy, and I sometimes found myself questioning if I had done enough. But in those moments, I reminded myself that healing didn't happen in a straight line. It took time. It took patience. And most of all, it took a willingness to face the truth, to confront the mistakes, and to be vulnerable enough to seek forgiveness. As the weeks went on, I began to notice changes within myself. I was no longer the person I had been when all of this started, the woman who had allowed herself to be manipulated, the one who had ignored the warnings of those who loved her. I was becoming someone stronger, more self-aware, more committed to living with integrity. I had learned to set boundaries, to protect my own peace, and to trust in my own judgment once again. The lessons had been hard, but they had reshaped me, made me someone better, someone more capable of handling the complexities of life. I also started to realize that forgiveness wasn't just something I needed from my family. I had to forgive myself. For the longest time, I had held on to the belief that I wasn't worthy of forgiveness, that my mistake was too big to be overlooked. But the truth was, no one is perfect. We all make mistakes, some larger than others. But those mistakes don't have to define who we are. What mattered was how we responded to them, how we took responsibility and worked toward making things right. It was in this space of self-forgiveness that I began to feel the first true sense of peace I had felt in months. I had learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past or pretending that nothing had happened. It was about accepting what had occurred, owning my mistakes, and doing everything in my power to repair the damage. It was about showing my family that I had learned and grown, and it was about showing myself that I could be stronger than my mistakes. One day, as I sat with my son in the living room, we talked, not about the past, not about the betrayal, but about the future. It was a conversation that felt light, almost normal. There were no accusations, no bitterness, just 2 people trying to understand each other again. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was progress. And progress was all I could ask for. For the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. The road ahead was still long, but I had taken the first step toward healing, and that was enough. I wasn't sure where the future would lead, but I knew that I had learned something valuable. Forgiveness, of others and of myself, was the key to moving forward. Without it, there could be no peace, no resolution. But with it, there was the possibility of rebuilding, of growing, and of finding joy again. The emotional resolution hadn't come easily, and it certainly hadn't come quickly. But in the end, I had come to understand that the journey to healing was about more than just fixing what was broken. It was about becoming whole again, about learning to live with the past, to grow from it, and to look forward to the future with hope and gratitude. The sun was setting on a quiet afternoon, the golden hues of the evening light streaming through the window, casting long shadows across the room. It had been a long, difficult journey, one filled with emotional turmoil, heartbreak, and moments of deep reflection. But as I sat there, in the calmness of that moment, I realized that I had come through it all. The road had been painful, but it had brought me to a place of understanding, of acceptance, and, finally, of peace. I had spent so many years building walls around my heart, guarding myself against the possibility of being hurt, of being deceived. But through all the pain, I had learned something important, that vulnerability, while it made me susceptible to hurt, was also the gateway to healing. It was through opening myself up again, through admitting my mistakes and facing the truth, that I had found a path forward. The person I had once been, strong, independent, but closed off, had been transformed by the very experiences that had broken me. Now, sitting in the quiet of my living room, I could feel the weight lifting from my shoulders. My relationship with my children was far from perfect, but it was no longer fractured beyond repair. We had come to an understanding, each of us taking small steps toward forgiveness, toward healing. The scars of the past would always remain, but they no longer defined us. They were simply a part of our story, a story that had its dark chapters, but also its moments of light. I thought back to the first time I had realized I had made the biggest mistake of my life, the moment when the truth hit me, and everything I had once believed was shattered. That moment had been the beginning of a long journey, one filled with tears, regrets, and self-doubt. But now, as I sat here, I realized that it had also been the beginning of my transformation. The pain, the betrayal, had forced me to confront parts of myself I had long ignored. It had forced me to look inward, to understand why I had made the choices I did, and to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made. My son, who had been the most hurt by my actions, was now sitting beside me, no longer distant, no longer filled with anger. He had his own journey to walk, his own healing to do, but we had reached a place where we could speak to each other without the heavy weight of resentment between us. His hand rested on mine, a simple gesture, but one that meant the world to me. It was a sign that we were moving forward, that the past no longer held us captive. My daughter, too, had begun to open up again. She had been quiet throughout this process, retreating into herself as she processed the pain I had caused. But she had also begun to reach out. We spent more time together, talking, laughing, sharing memories from the past, and slowly, we were finding our way back to each other. The bond we had once shared, though scarred, was still there. And now, I could feel it healing, slowly but surely. The family dinners, which had once been filled with tension and silence, were beginning to feel like they used to. Laughter echoed around the table once more, and though there were still moments of discomfort, there was also the unmistakable sense that we were reconnecting, that we were finding our way back to the family we had once been. The road had been long, and there were times when I wondered if we would ever be the same again. But now, I knew that we didn't need to be the same. We had all changed, and that change, though painful, had brought us to a place of understanding and compassion. I had spent so many years chasing perfection, thinking that I had to get everything right, that I had to protect myself from making mistakes. But now, I understood that perfection was an illusion. It was the mistakes, the failures, and the lessons learned from them that had shaped me into the person I was today. I had come to accept that I wasn't perfect, that I had flaws, that I had made mistakes, big ones, yes, but that I was still worthy of love, of forgiveness, and of a second chance. And so were the people I loved. I looked out the window, watching the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was a beautiful sight, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always light. The past, with all its pain and mistakes, had shaped me, but it no longer held me in its grip. I had learned to let go, to forgive myself, and to embrace the possibility of a new beginning. As I sat there, with my family around me, I realized that this was the moment I had been waiting for. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a significant turning point. I had faced my fears, my regrets, and my shame, and I had come through the other side stronger, more whole than I had ever been. The person I had been at the beginning of this story, confused, lost, and consumed by guilt, was no longer the person I was today. I had learned that healing takes time, that forgiveness is a process, and that love is the greatest force of all. And in that moment, as I looked at my children, I knew that we would be okay. We would continue to heal, to rebuild, and to move forward together. We had been through the darkest of times, but we had come out the other side. The future was uncertain, but I knew that with each other, we could face whatever came our way. I reached for my son's hand again, and this time, he squeezed mine tightly. My daughter sat across from me, her eyes soft with understanding, and in that moment, I knew that no matter what had happened in the past, we had made it through. We had found our way back to each other, and that was all that mattered. The sunset outside faded into the night, but inside, the warmth of family, of forgiveness, and of love filled the room. We were no longer defined by our mistakes. We were defined by how we had risen from them, how we had chosen to move forward, and how we had chosen to love each other, flaws and all.